Nobody found this in a government archive, and nobody ever proved a word of it. But canyon folks have been passing this one down for over 100 years. So here it is, told the way it's always been told. And you can decide for yourself what you believe by the time it's over. In the spring of 1936, a widow in Flagstaff, Arizona, was going through her late husband's things when she found a single torn page at the bottom of an old cigar box. No cover, no date, just a string of coordinates in his cramped handwriting and one sentence underneath them. 5 words, nothing else. The walls were too smooth, and she had no idea what it meant. Because in over 25 years of marriage, her husband Samuel Whitaker had never once spoken about the spring of 1909, the one season in his long career as a government surveyor that he never wrote a single official word about. And to understand what happened to him that April, you have to go back to a Grand Canyon that barely resembled the one you know today, 3 years before Arizona was even a state, when the roads were dirt and the rim towns were tents and lumber shacks. When the Geological Survey sent small parties of men out onto that plateau with brass instruments worth more than the mules that carried them, men who lived for months at a stretch on hardtack, dried beef, and canyon water, sunburned to leather, their boots worn through by August, and Samuel Whitaker was one of those men, 31 years old, 6 years into the job, known up and down the rim for exactly one thing. He did not exaggerate, he did not speculate. And when other surveyors came back from a long stretch with wild stories about mountain lions or strange lights on the horizon, Whitaker came back with numbers. So when this particular story starts with Whitaker's own handwriting describing something he could not explain, that tells you everything you need to know about how strange it really was. Because on the morning of April 17th, 1909, he took a single packer named Ruiz and walked into an unnamed side canyon on the north rim to check a routine survey point. Nothing more than that. A benchmark buried by a flood the season before. An afternoon's work, the kind of assignment nobody remembers making, and nobody, under ordinary circumstances, remembers doing. Except that while he was sighting his transit along a limestone wall about a quarter-mile in, with the temperature already climbing and the rock throwing back heat like an oven door left open, he noticed a line running straight up the rock face, and a crack in limestone does not run straight. It wanders. It follows the grain of the stone. It widens and narrows and forks the way every fracture in every canyon wall on Earth has always done. And this line did none of those things. It ran arrow straight for 40 feet, without a single deviation, and met a second line at a perfect right angle. Corner, sharp enough to lay a level against. And Samuel Whitaker, a man who did not use the word remarkable in 6 years of field notes, a man whose chief used to say his notebooks read like the desert had been photographed, with a pencil, wrote in his notebook that afternoon that this could not be a natural fracture, that the edges were too regular to support that assumption, and recommended further examination. And that is the last entirely ordinary sentence he ever wrote about what he found in that canyon. Now, before we go any further into that canyon with him, if stories like this are the kind of thing that gets under your skin, hit subscribe right now. Because what Whitaker and his crew found behind that wall is the kind of thing that canyon guides still won't talk about on the record. Not even after a few drinks, not even to tourists who ask directly. And once we're inside, there's no easy way back out. So drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Because a story like this is always better with company, And if you've got your own local legend, the kind your grandfather swore was true, leave it below, because we read every single one, and stick around, because it only gets stranger from here, a lot stranger, and you're going to want to see how this one ends. It took Whitaker and Ruiz nearly 2 hours working with hand tools in that narrow shadowed gap where the sun never quite reached the canyon floor, tearing at a slope of loose rock that, looking back, seemed less like a natural rockfall and more like the collapsed remains of something that had once stood upright guarding that spot. Stone stacked in a way that gravity alone doesn't usually arrange it. And by the time they cleared enough of it, both men's hands were split and bleeding at the knuckles, their shirts soaked through despite the shade. And when they finally cleared it, they weren't looking at a crack or a hollow in the stone. They were looking at a doorway, cut square and clean into solid rock, wide enough for 3 men to walk through shoulder to shoulder, and the air coming out of it was cold, noticeably colder than the canyon around it, cold enough that Ruiz felt it on his face from 6 feet back and would not go any closer. Not that day and not for the rest of the trip, no matter what his foreman said to him. And Whitaker, being Whitaker, picked up a single lantern, said nothing, and walked in alone, boots echoing in a way that told him almost immediately the space ahead was bigger than anything a canyon wall should be able to hide. And what he found on the other side of that passage was not a cave. It opened after about 60 feet into a chamber so wide his lantern light couldn't reach the far wall. The flame just seemed to thin out and vanish into black. And when the full crew came back over the following days to measure it properly, working by lantern and magnesium flash, because no daylight reached that deep, that chamber came out to nearly 400 feet across, almost a perfect circle, ringed by 36 stone columns, spaced so evenly that the difference between any 2 of them came out to less than an inch. Each one measured at the same width, down to a fraction. And beyond those columns, the walls were polished smooth in a way stone simply does not become on its own, not worn down by water, not scoured by wind over 10,000 years, smooth like it had been finished on purpose, by hands or by something else entirely. No chisel marks, no drill scoring, nothing a working stonecutter from that era or any era before it would recognize as a tool mark. And hallways ran off that central chamber in a symmetry that made the surveyor's compass readings almost eerie in their sameness. The same bearings and the same distances mirrored over and over down every corridor, as if whoever built this place had never once seen a reason to build anything crooked. And there were square shafts running straight up out of several of those hallways into a darkness so deep and so total that when the crew's cook, a man named Doss, dropped a stone down one of them out of pure curiosity, it was more to break the silence than anything else. The whole party stood frozen and silent for a full 10 seconds, 10 long seconds in that cold air, before anyone heard it hit bottom. And even then, nobody was quite sure they'd actually heard it, or just wanted to, and the temperature never moved. 61 degrees on the nose, checked 4 separate times over the better part of a week, by a chief surveyor who didn't believe Whitaker's numbers until he checked them twice himself with his own thermometer. And underneath all of it, there was a sound, or something close to a sound. Less something you heard than something you felt in your back teeth and in the small bones behind your ears. A low, steady pressure that none of them could trace to any source, no matter how many times they walked the perimeter, listening for it. and that stopped, according to Whitaker's own notes, the instant the party got clear of that doorway and back out into the ordinary canyon air, like a hand had been lifted off the back of your neck. And in his private diary, the one page that was never meant for any official file, the one page his chief never saw, Whitaker wrote that his chief wanted adjectives for the report, and he had none that felt honest, that a man can describe a canyon. But he wasn't sure a man could describe this and be believed, or even quite believe it himself once he was back up in the sun. So he only ever told anyone that the walls were too smooth, and left it right there. For 2 weeks that crew did the strangest thing imaginable, considering what they'd found. They went back to work, mapping and measuring and photographing that chamber with the exact same flat, business-like diligence they'd have given a bridge abutment or a section line, requesting more lantern oil and more glass plates, through the regular supply channels like nothing in the world was out of the ordinary, filing supplemental orders in the same dry government language they'd have used for any routine survey. And if the men felt something enormous sitting underneath all that paperwork, and surely they must have, none of it shows on the page, and that, in its own way, might be the strangest part of the whole record, that it reads as though nothing strange had happened at all. And then, on April 25th, a telegram came back from the district office with instructions to hold their position, continue documentation, and keep every negative and field book under seal, because additional personnel were on the way, and the first week of May, right on schedule, they arrived. 2 men from the district office and a third man introduced to the crew only as a specialist. A man whose name never once appears anywhere in the surviving paperwork, not on a single requisition form, not on a single telegram, and what happened next wasn't dramatic. There were no threats, no men in dark coats standing in doorways. Nothing you'd expect from a cover story out of a film. There was only a great deal of quiet repetition. The chamber remeasured from scratch, as though the first measurements had never happened. The columns remeasured one by one. New photographs taken to replace old ones that had come back from the developing chemicals with a strange banding fault running clean across the plate. A fault nobody could explain, and that showed up again on the second exposure of the exact same subject. And Whitaker's original field notebook was collected, along with his chief's, for what one short memo, called consolidation with the district files, a phrase that shows up exactly once in the entire surviving record, and never again anywhere else. And the survey sheet marking that Canyon's location was quietly superseded by a new one with a new number. And the site itself was left off the next printed topographic map entirely, simply omitted. And within the month, the whole crew had been split up and reassigned to routine work on opposite ends of the territory. The kind of transfer that happened to surveyors all the time, for reasons nobody ever had to explain because nobody ever thought to ask. And the canyon simply closed back up behind them, the way paperwork always finds a way to close things up. Quietly, efficiently, without anyone ever having to say why out loud. Samuel Whitaker went on surveying for almost 30 more years. First in Arizona, then briefly out in Nevada chasing river elevation work. Then, back home once Arizona finally became a state in 1912, and every man who worked under him in those later years describes him exactly the same way his first chief did, quiet, precise, allergic to telling stories around the fire even when the whiskey was going around. and he never published one word about April of 1909, never so much as hinted at it, in a letter that survives, and as far as anyone who knew him could ever recall, he never spoke about it out loud again. Not once. Not even to his own wife across 25 years of marriage. Not even, apparently, on his deathbed. Right up until he died quietly in Flagstaff in 1936 at the age of 68. An ordinary death for an ordinary working man, and it was only after his passing that his widow went through his effects and found that torn page at the bottom of a cigar box, tucked in under a pocket watch and a stack of unremarkable correspondence nobody would ever think twice about. That string of unlabelled coordinates in pencil, faded but legible, and beneath them, in his same small, careful hand from 30 years earlier, unmistakably his. That same 5 words he'd apparently carried with him his entire life without ever once explaining them to a living soul. The walls were too smooth. No context, no explanation. Nothing to say what those coordinates even pointed to, or why, out of everything a man collects across 68 years on this earth. That was the one page he chose to keep. None of what happened to Whitaker's crew ever reached a single newspaper. Not one line, but the Grand Canyon that same spring was already the subject of one completely separate story. A short, breathless article that ran in the Arizona Gazette in April of 1909 describing an explorer who claimed to have found a vast underground citadel cut deep into the canyon rock, complete with carved chambers, long corridors, and evidence of some ancient civilization nobody could name. And that article is 100% real. It really was printed. People really read it over their breakfast that spring, and to this day no expedition record and no explorer matching that description has ever surfaced to back it up. No follow-up story, no confirmation, nothing. And most historians call it a hoax dressed up to sell papers in a territory that was hungry for wonders and short on entertainment. But canyon guides and old river hands were never much interested in what historians think. And for generations now, passed down at river camps and around late-night fires on the rim, some of them have quietly connected Whitaker's story to that newspaper story, insisting the 2 crews stumbled into the very same place from opposite ends of the same canyon, weeks apart, without either one ever knowing about the other, and there is nothing in any official record that ties those 2 stories together. In fact, almost everything in the record argues against it. The dates don't line up cleanly. The locations are never specified closely enough to match. But that has never once stopped a good canyon legend from growing exactly where the paperwork happens to run out. And that's really the only honest way to leave this one, because nobody can prove Samuel Whitaker ever found anything at all down in that canyon. There's no chamber marked on any surviving map. No coordinates anyone's ever managed to match to a real location on the ground. Just an old torn page, 5 words in pencil, and well, over 100 years of canyon hands telling the story anyway, passing it down the way people always pass down the things they can't quite explain. So if you're ever standing on that north rim near sundown and the wind happens to drop out for a second, and everything goes strangely, unnaturally quiet, maybe don't go looking too hard for a straight line in the rock. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe right now. Because the canyon's got more than one legend like this one still buried in it, and we are not done digging, not even close.